Welcome back to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We were in the middle of the Vicksburg Campaign. Grant and Sherman had a genius plan to attack Vicksburg from two fronts, but Grant was continually being harassed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, so he wasn't able to successfully reach Vicksburg. So now we're going to come to the third attempt to take Vicksburg, and we'll see if it works well and finally breaks a blockade, and the Union can now access the entire length of the Mississippi River. Beyond that, cut off supplies that the Confederacy has access to the west in Texas and down into Mexico, possibly issuing a crippling blow to the Confederacy. James, do they issue that crippling blow in this attempt?
Well, you're just going to have to wait to find out.
The suspense is killing me. We'll see.
All right. So we saw last time, as Scott mentioned, that Grant and Sherman had decided just to march down from Tennessee. They were on the eastern side, the Mississippi side of the Mississippi River, and they marched down and they were about to attack, and their supply lines were messed up, especially Grant's. Nathan Bedford Forrest made it to where Grant had to go back and retreat. Sherman was repelled by a Confederate force. So back to the old drawing board, do-over. But Grant was smart, especially in a military sense, and he realized that if you just do the same exact thing, you're going to get the same exact result. So he comes up with a new plan. This time, he and the army are going to march down the west side of the river. So they're going to be in Louisiana, which was a little bit safer for Union forces. You didn't have Nathan Bedford Forrest riding around the swamps of Louisiana like he was in Mississippi, and it wasn't going to be easy for him to get over there. So Grant is going to quickly try to march down the west side of the river. The river fleet is going to come down, and when they get to the Vicksburg and they face the batteries, the mighty guns that are part of the city's defenses, they're going to just run right by them. They're going to run the gauntlet, get past the batteries, and then once they're on the south side of Vicksburg, they're going to ferry the soldiers across the Mississippi so that they would be south of the city. All right, so let's do a mental map for our listeners. I always say this, if you can, pull out an actual map, get one off Google or whatever, Wikipedia, but if you're driving, then please don't do that. Instead, imagine the Mississippi River running right down the middle of your map, north to south. Vicksburg is on the right side or the eastern side of the river. So this time, instead of coming down that same side, Grant's going to come down the left side of the river, the west side of the river, and he's going to come down, and at the same time, the Union fleet is going to come down, and it's going to go past Vicksburg and just take their lumps. They're going to fire at the defenses. They're going to do it at night so as to hopefully avoid detection, at least for a while. And once they get past the Confederate defenses, assuming they're not all sunk, then they're going to ferry Grant's troops from the left side of the river or west side of the river to the right side, the east side, and then come around and hit Vicksburg that way. All right, so let's see if it works. And again, like I said, it's very risky. I mean, what would happen, for example, if, let's say, the first ship or two is hit and disabled and sunk, and what if they block the river so that the others can't even get past them? They'd be sitting ducks. They'd have to try to turn around and go upriver, which they were steamboats. So it's possible, but it's going to be very difficult and slow. It's a very gutsy plan. Here we see this is one Union commander who is bold and gutsy, and he's not slow and plodding and methodical like so many others we've seen before. As Lincoln had said, we saw this at the end of last episode, I can't spare this man. He fights. Grant is going to fight. And he's just going to find a way. He's determined. All right. He mentioned this plan to his subordinates. They didn't like it. They said it's too risky. They mentioned some of the things that I just mentioned, some of the things that could go wrong. Sherman said, hey, let's just go back to Memphis. And that seems amazing. That seems out of character for Sherman because, as we're going to see, Sherman is pretty aggressive himself. Sherman says, let's just go back to Memphis and get restocked, get resupplied, get ready to go, and really do some more planning and then start out again. Grant said, no, we're not going back to Memphis. He says that if we go back to Memphis, it would be too bad for Northern morale. The North is tired of Union generals retreating. They've seen almost nothing but that in the East, at least. We've got to keep marching forward. So he does. They start marching down Louisiana, in Louisiana next to the Mississippi River. And as I mentioned, it's very swampy there. But they build corduroy roads, which are basically laying out a bunch of boards, or logs, actually. In most cases, they didn't really take the time to turn the logs into lumber, but they cut down trees. They lay down the tree, the trunks. They're long logs, basically. They lay them down and they walk across there, and that way they're at least walking on something that's hard, and the wagon wheels are not going to get stuck in the mud or in the swamp or anything like that. And that enables them to move relatively quickly. On the evening of April 16th, 1863, the Union River Fleet, now commanded by David Dixon Porter, they decide it's time. And so they steam past the batteries. They go as fast as they can. They go at night. Many of the ships put cotton bales on their decks to absorb the blow of the Confederate shells. And some people call these cotton clads. We've talked about ironclads a little bit. These are cotton clads. And some of these ships were ironclad too. But they were hoping that the cotton would absorb and soak up some of the shells that were going to be shot at them. The Confederates, they weren't dumb. They knew they heard the ships coming. They knew what was going on. And so they lit huge bonfires to help them see the ships. Grant was there with one of his sons, and Grant's son later wrote that it was almost as bright as day, even though it was the middle of the night, because of these bonfires. And so the Union ship is going by as fast as they can, the ships, the fleet, and they're firing at the batteries, and the Confederate defenses open up and they fire at the Union vessels. Every Union vessel was hit. Some caught on fire, but only 8 were sunk. And that's out of 30. So that's pretty good. 8 out of 30. Yeah. So they get 22 out of 30 through, and then they get south of the Vicksburg defenses, and they do exactly what Grant had planned. There were a lot of transports in the group. They ferry the men from the west side of the river to the east side of the river. And now he had 23,000 troops in Mississippi and near the town. Meanwhile, on April 17th, Federal cavalry under a commander named Benjamin Grierson, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a minute, but I'll finish up the thought. General Grierson leads a raid into Tennessee, and over 17 days, his command marches 800 miles. They repeatedly engage the Confederates. They disable 2 railroads, they capture many prisoners and horses, and they destroy vast amounts of property. And this also distracted Confederate cavalry from opposing Grant's crossing. So it's kind of a diversion movement, if you will. And this General Grierson is an amazing guy because he's like Forrest in that he had no previous military experience. You know what he did before the war?
I'm going to guess, what's the most uncavalry-like job? Banker.
Well, almost as uncavalry-like. He was a music teacher.
I would say that's even more uncavalry-like. Wow.
Yeah, more playing musical instruments, and this just mild-mannered, gentle guy teaching kids how to play instruments. But instead, he turns into this incredible cavalry. He was another one of these completely unprofessional people that just picked it up, like Forrest. They just had a knack for it.
So Mr. Holland's Opus goes to war. Wow.
Absolutely, and kicks some serious butt and distracts Forrest. He keeps Forrest busy so that Forrest can't go down there and harass Grant as he tries to move his forces over from the west to the east side of the river. So it's a pretty amazing thing. Grierson goes on later to be commander of Buffalo Soldiers after the Civil War. These, of course, were cavalry units that were all African American that fought out in the West. They fought in some of the Indian Wars, and Grierson was their commander.
The pieces are in place now. I mean, finally, there's been some success in a plan being executed. It's not just retreat back. So, yeah, let's look at it. Let's get into the thick of it.
All right. In early May, General Sherman marches down and joins Grant. He joins the party once again. He's itching for a fight, having lost and been driven back earlier. And now Grant has a total of 40,000 men. And Grant does something, I hinted at this earlier. Grant's tired of supply lines. He sees all this rich, bountiful country around him. He sees these orchards and he sees these big farms and plantations. And so he cuts himself off completely from his supply line and he lives completely off the land for 2 weeks. No one in the North knew where he was. He had no communications. They didn't know where Grant was. They didn't know where his army was. And I should probably clarify, Scott, for those that don't really, I've touched on this before, but maybe if somebody doesn't really know what I'm talking about when I say cutting yourself off from your supply line. We all know, of course, that an army has to eat. And prior to this, the way Union armies ate as they marched further and further south into the Confederacy is they just brought wagons with them. They had wagons full of supplies coming down from the north toward where the armies were, bringing them the food and the medicine and the ammunition and all that, everything they needed, replacement shoes, replacement uniforms and whatnot. But what Grant is going to do is just get rid of the wagons. He's going to send them back and say, I don't need you. And he's just going to go to farms and he's going to, shall we say, requisition things to eat for his army. He's going to take what he needs from the surrounding countryside. Later on, we're going to see Sherman is going to epically do this on a grand scale, but Grant is doing it right now. And his chief opponent, as we've mentioned before, was Confederate General John C. Pemberton. He had 32,000 troops with him with which to defend Vicksburg. Now, there was one other small Confederate army in the area that had the potential to cause Grant some trouble, and that was an army under our old friend who we've seen before, Joseph Johnston. Joseph Johnston, who was one of the heroes of First Bull Run, at least heroes from the Southern perspective. He had also been the first army commander who had opposed McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign and helped keep McClellan at bay. He was wounded and replaced by Robert E. Lee. Well, now he's recovered from his wounds and he is the overall commander of the West. He was given Bragg's job. General Bragg had been relieved of command because he'd had too many losses, too many complete epic collapses. We saw Perryville, we saw Murfreesboro or Stones River, where Bragg marched north and was driven back both times. I have to say, I didn't talk much about Bragg. He was a very cranky kind of guy. Nobody liked him. He had some physical problems and they caused him to be extremely sensitive, extremely irritable. And when I was in college, Scott, as an undergraduate, I took a Civil War history class, and the teaching assistant or TA of the course was a really neat guy. He actually was a sergeant in a local reenactor company, which I joined for a few months anyway. And he famously said, well, I shouldn't say famously because nobody's heard this probably other than a few people, but he said the Confederacy lost the Civil War in 1848 when a shell rolled into General Bragg's tent, or Braxton Bragg's tent. He was just a lieutenant or something. This is during the Mexican War. A shell rolled into his tent and did not explode. That's how badly he felt about Bragg. He couldn't stand Bragg. He thought Bragg basically lost the war for the Confederacy. That may be too much of an exaggeration, but anyway, Bragg was out. Johnston is in again. And that really galled Jefferson Davis because Jefferson Davis really liked Bragg, but he couldn't stand Joseph Johnston. But anyway, Johnston has 16,000 troops at Jackson, Mississippi, which is a little bit to the east of Vicksburg. And so Grant realized, if I start attacking Vicksburg and I've got my back to Jackson, well, what if Johnston comes in and hits me from behind and then I'm surrounded? I can't have that. So Grant, instead of going straight to Vicksburg, he marches around Mississippi. He marches 180 miles. He fights 2 battles and wins both of them, Port Gibson and Raymond, fairly minor battles that nobody's heard of. He defeats 8,000 Confederate soldiers, and he also cuts Confederate rail and communication links. So he does a little bit of Forrest himself, doesn't he?
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll show you who can raise some more hell. So he does that, and he also confused the enemy because instead of marching to Vicksburg, as I kind of touched on a minute ago, he marched away from Vicksburg. He marches east, and he marches toward Jackson. And on May 14th, he attacks Jackson, it's kind of confusing because the city is Jackson, but the commander is Johnston.
Right.
he that's kind of a tongue. He attacks Johnston in Jackson and drives him away.
But Stonewall Jackson is not part of this, obviously.
Yeah, this is not. Stonewall Jackson is in his grave by this point. He is dead, sadly for the Confederacy, but good for the Union. He died on May 10th, 1863, just a few days before this, after Chancellorsville. All right, so Sherman also destroys part of the town of Jackson. He burns up the supplies that are of military value. He's warming up for Atlanta and Columbia, South Carolina, which will happen later. But Grant then, after he's driven Joseph Johnston away from Jackson, then he turns back around and goes back toward Vicksburg. Pemberton marches out to meet him on May 16th at a small battle called Champion Hill. Grant completely crushes Pemberton. He attacks again the next day, defeats Pemberton again at Big Black River. This is so like not Eastern Front, isn't it? Or Eastern Theater. It's like, here we see Union victory after victory after victory. It's the polar opposite of what has happened so far pretty much in the East. And then they fight another battle. Grant wins again. I'm leaving out some details, but just to get to the point, Pemberton finally realizes, I've got to retreat into the defenses of Vicksburg. He's got to get back into the fortifications. Johnston wires him and he urges him to unite with Johnston's forces. In other words, Johnston says, let's join up together and together we can defeat Grant, but Pemberton refuses. On May 19th, Grant decides let's try and see if we can actually attack Vicksburg directly. Let's hit them head on. So he launches a frontal assault. Naturally, this fails. I mean, he wanted to at least try. He later wrote that I had to at least give it a shot. So it doesn't work. He tries and fails again 3 days later on May 22nd. The Federals lose 4,000 casualties. Again, Vicksburg is very high up. Scott had compared it to the Lord of the Rings series, the Two Towers movie where you had Minas Tirith, this big castle. Maybe not quite like that, but it's still a very, very tough position. Again, Federals lose 4,000 casualties trying to hit the city and take it from directly just by storming it, by assaulting it. Doesn't work. So Grant then finally decides he didn't want to do this, but he realized the only way he was going to capture the city was to lay siege to it. And of course, I guess most of our listeners know what that means, to lay siege. I always ask my students, I said, do you know what a siege is? And I typically get no responses. So it's like, come on, haven't you watched a movie with a medieval castle or something? But basically, the city is completely, it's got water on one side, right? It's backed up to the Mississippi River. And now we've seen the Federal Navy controls that river. And on the other side, it's completely behind a bunch of fortifications, big fortified walls, basically, some natural, some man-made. So Grant has basically got the city surrounded, and he's going to starve it into submission. He's going to just sit out there and just for good measure, just for fun, lob in some cannonballs and some shells and try to terrorize the population while at the same time waiting them out and waiting until they just can't eat or drink anymore, and then they'll have to surrender.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Groothuis, host of Truth Tribe. where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Once we get into the siege, this is interesting within the walls because, as James mentioned in the last episode, Pemberton was never fully embraced. He was a Northerner who married a Southerner. So right there, some people question his loyalties to the Confederacy. And within the walls of Vicksburg, there's men returning from Champion Hill and Big Black River, and they, at this point, a lot of them think surrender is inevitable. And some of them think that Pemberton, this Northerner, maybe wants to betray them and surrender to Grant. And there's talk of people calling him a coward or a traitor. So there's some of the officers of Pemberton tell him about these rumors are going around. And we know that he reacts to this specifically, and this strikes a nerve with him because he issues a proclamation, and he has it read throughout the army that says, "You have heard that I was incompetent and a traitor, and that it was my intention to sell Vicksburg. Follow me, and you will see the cost at which I will sell Vicksburg. When the last pound of beef, bacon, and flour, the last grain of corn, the last cow and hog, and horse and dog shall have been consumed, and the last man shall have perished in the trenches, then and only then will I sell Vicksburg." Okay, so those are the words, but James, do things kind of get close to that in a way as the siege goes on?
They do. They hold out as long as they can. So they're being bombarded. It's absolutely a horrific situation for the residents of Vicksburg. We have to remember that a lot of these people are just innocent civilians, and they are in great danger. There's constant artillery fire coming in and blowing up houses and setting them on fire and killing people, whether they're soldiers or whether they're civilians. And a lot of residents of Vicksburg, in order to avoid the artillery fire, they actually went and lived in caves. They made little dugout and tried to live as best as they could in caves. Literally, you can still see those caves today.
Sounds like the Blitz in London in World War II.
It's just it's just an awful situation. And the food, of course, begins to run out, and as we saw in the proclamation, it actually does happen. They're reduced to eating horses and then mules. And then before long, dogs and cats start mysteriously disappearing. And then finally, rats, and the people are starving, as usually happens in a siege like this. And the Vicksburg newspaper was defiant. They continued to print it, but eventually it had to be printed on wallpaper. Just leftover wallpaper because they ran out of regular paper. And by the end of the siege, it was just one little square of newspaper. But they did the best they could. The people did of the city, and the army did the best they could. But they just really had no chance. And so after about 6 weeks of around-the-clock bombardment from both sides, including sniper fire, exploding mines. I didn't even talk about the mines. They tried to tunnel under the walls, and that didn't work, of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course, but it didn't work. Dwindling food supplies, all these things added up. Finally, Pemberton surrenders on July 4th. The 4th of July, he has to surrender. And here's the outcome. Grant, during this siege and this campaign, the entire campaign, he suffers fewer than 10,000 casualties. He inflicts 10,000 on the Confederates, and then he captures 37,000. Including 30,000 in Vicksburg. So all these soldiers, 30,000 soldiers who were defending Vicksburg in the area, they surrender. So that army vanishes. Poof, it's gone. That's the first time we've seen an entire Confederate army captured and put out of service. And then, by the way, they don't take them as prisoners. They are paroled. And you're not going to have a lot of prisoners taken until later in the war. We'll talk about that later. But essentially, what's going on is the way parole works is you just send them home, and they sign a paper agreeing not to fight until they're exchanged. So an exchange is let's say, Scott, you and I are fighting each other. You're a Union general. I'm a Confederate general. You have 500 prisoners. I have 500 prisoners. We just swap them. In that case, when you actually exchange prisoners, they do immediately go back into the ranks if they're assuming they're healthy enough. But with parole, you just send them home and they agree not to fight again. But they could still be exchanged later. Let's say you have 1,000 of my people. I have 500 of yours, but there's 500 who have been paroled, i.e. sent home. Well, 500 of those get to come back, and then we swap the others. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of confusing, but you don't have a whole lot of prisoners of war in the sense that we think of it until a little bit later when African-American soldiers begin fighting for the North. At that point, the system breaks down because the Confederates refuse to treat African-Americans as soldiers. They treat them as runaway slaves, even if they were free originally in the North. So that's when you start having the big prison camps like Andersonville. We may touch on that at some point in the future. Grant also captures 127 cannon and 60,000 rifles. Not a bad haul if you can get it, right?
Not bad, yeah.
And Lincoln is just completely, the North is absolutely ecstatic. And something else happens in the East the day before, which we will talk about in the next episode. We're going thematically, not strictly chronologically here. We're kind of looking at the East and the West. So I'll save what happens in the East, but this happens one day after a major Union victory in the East. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch against the Confederacy. Lincoln says, Grant is my man. Davis blames Johnston for the loss to Vicksburg, which he was accustomed to doing. Davis, as I mentioned, hated Joe Johnston, and he blamed him for pretty much everything. He said he thought Johnston should have run over there and bailed out Pemberton somehow, but he wasn't able to. Most Confederates blamed Pemberton, and the 4th of July would not be celebrated again in Vicksburg for 81 years. So 4th of July, even after Mississippi comes back in the Union, not a holiday in Vicksburg. So just forget your parades, forget your fireworks, forget your barbecue. It ain't going to happen.
Wow, so that would be what, in the 40s, around World War II, if my math is correct?
Let's see, 44, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
By then, I think that's not like they'd forgotten it, but by then it wasn't quite as, several generations had passed by that point. We're in the middle of World War II. We need more patriotism.
Yeah, so the long memory there. And speaking of long memory, just a little bit more about Pemberton. Before the siege, people questioned or were suspicious of his loyalty to the South. And then afterwards, like you said, Southerners largely blame him. He's just savaged in the Southern press. He's called a failure, a bungling fool, a traitor. And just another element, too, that we've talked about, the memory of the Civil War. Some of these myths we've attempted to dismantle, where some figures are treated as these larger-than-life geniuses who can do no wrong, like Robert E. Lee, or Grant is this drunken fool. We're not saying Grant is perfect. We're not discounting Lee's brilliance in many different cases in the war. But a lot of these narratives, arguably, what historians would say, were perpetuated by the South, because many Southerners wrote the first Civil War histories, and much of the record of Vicksburg was written first in the Southern press account, and then Southerners as well who were looking for scapegoats. So Pemberton has, I don't know if I would say that he is being rehabilitated. There are some authors who are trying to take another look at him and say that he was a loyal Southerner for whatever that's worth, despite being from Pennsylvania, and as the statement says, was willing to die for the Confederacy. And he wasn't indecisive. He had, some say he was indecisive in trying to seek out aid for Vicksburg, but instead this had to do with petty grudges between him and other commanding generals. So anyway, that's just another factor too, that sort of the history that's written immediately afterwards paints him as a scapegoat. But
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that, all people sometimes have a tendency to scapegoat. Oftentimes we want to blame others for our own failings, but it just seemed like the Southerners some of them were actual generals in the Civil War, and then others later. They, especially Southern historians, military leaders, scholars, and whatnot, they had a tendency to really scapegoat. They just could not accept the possibility that they were just beaten fair and square, and they were beaten enough times to where they lost the war. It just seemed to them like there had to be some other reason. You had to have traitorous commanders or incompetent people like Pemberton, for example. They blamed Longstreet. It was another one that got blamed a lot because he wasn't aggressive enough. He was actually a more defensive-minded general, really more forward-looking, as we'll see when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. But it's just very interesting that you had this idea of the lost cause and the idea that, yeah, we would have won if we had equal resources, but we had too many fatal things happen to us. It wasn't really our fault that we lost. It was just we were dealing with too many disadvantages that we couldn't help.
Right. That, well, we had a severe manpower shortage, but then they would say, well, despite that, we did well. And the Northerners were these effete city boys who couldn't handle the hot climate. So they were being taken out by disease and fatigue from the weather where our, Southern boys could keep going. But yeah, anyway, we'll get more into that. I think, especially when we match up Grant versus Lee, because I think a lot of this mythologizing can come down to them, and they instill a lot of these stereotypes and cliches that have to do with the Civil War. But let's look at what happens after this with a few other fortified positions. So could you talk about Port Hudson?
Sure. One of the misconceptions people have is that after Vicksburg, now the Union has complete control of the Mississippi and the Confederacy is cut in two. Technically, that's not correct because, as I mentioned before, the Confederates controlled a 200-mile river stretch. I don't mean it's not like land miles or by the way the crow flies, but it's the river bends a lot. 200 miles of river mileage was controlled between Vicksburg and Port Hudson. Port Hudson was the southern anchor of that. That's got to be taken too. You can't just take Vicksburg. You've got to take the other bookend of the Confederate controlled portion of the Mississippi. So that's exactly what happens. In late May, General Nathaniel Banks marches an army to the Confederate garrison at Port Hudson. And Port Hudson, like Vicksburg, was a major fortified position. It wasn't quite as powerful as Vicksburg, but it was still quite powerful. Banks, like Grant, twice tried frontal assaults in late May and early June, and he also was using African-American soldiers. I might mention in passing, the Confederates obviously were not very happy about that. Both of these assaults fail, and then also like Grant, Banks decides to lay siege to the town. The city surrenders on July 9th, and this is 5 days after Vicksburg falls. So on the 9th of July, now the Union controls the entire Mississippi. Nathaniel Banks is an interesting general. He was a political general. He had no military experience, at least nothing significant, not a West Pointer. He had served in Congress. He'd even been Speaker of the House for a while. He'd been governor of his state. Pretty sure it was Massachusetts, but I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. So don't sue me if it's the wrong state. But I do remember he was briefly Speaker of the House, but now he's a general. And here he has a significant victory. We're going to see later he's not going to have such a great career, but this gets him some notice. And he's basically just copying Grant. He's doing the same. He's using the Grant formula, which works.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Groothuis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Once Port Hudson was captured, that was another huge obstacle that was overthrown by the Union. Lincoln said famously, "The father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea." I love that quote. Lincoln had a way.
Yeah,
Lincoln was
poetic.
pretty decent with words, wasn't he?
He was,
pretty decent, pretty good. One other victory that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it was very important at the time that I want to mention is Tullahoma. This is in Tennessee. We talked about, at the beginning of last episode, we talked about the Battle of Murfreesboro or Stones River, which was in Tennessee. After that battle, that was the one that we've talked about several battles, and hopefully our listeners aren't going crazy, like trying to remember all these different things. But suffice it to say that was the one where Bragg, who at the time was in command of the Western Confederate armies, he marched north into Tennessee. And the Union commander Rosecrans marched down to meet him. They fought a battle there that lasted a few days and resulted in 30% casualties, which was the highest percentage that we've seen in the entire war, and we'll see. And since then, they had just been pretty much sitting there. Lincoln had been begging Rosecrans to get going, and Rosecrans finally does in June. This is several months later, because the Battle of Stones River was in December, January. So in June, Rosecrans marches his army of 63,000 southward, and he does a masterful thing here. Instead of hitting Bragg head on, he does the old flanking trick, not that it's a trick, but he will move around to one side of Bragg's army. He threatens to get behind, and he forces Bragg to retreat. And this just keeps going. It's almost like a dance. The Union starts to get around the Confederate lines. The Confederates back up. They go further south, further south, further south. And they finally end up at Chattanooga, which is where he had started from long ago. So again, it's a different kind of Union victory. It's actually not a bloody battle this time. It's actually a strategic, it's a strategic victory, but he's using tactical maneuvers just to push. It's almost like a sumo wrestling match. But if you can imagine where they're just moving, they're not even really pushing, trying to just get around. And so he basically pushes the Confederate army almost completely out of Tennessee. He's at Chattanooga, but of course that's in the extreme southeast corner of Tennessee. Any further, he'll be back into Georgia. So we had three major Union triumphs in this episode and in the year of 1863 within just not even 1 month of each other. In a less than 30-day period, we see Vicksburg falls, Port Hudson falls, the Mississippi is now completely under Union control, and then at Tullahoma, where Rosecrans is able to push the Confederates back almost out of Tennessee. These three victories provide a great boost to Northern morale, plus the other victory, which shall go unnamed for the time being, but we'll do it next time. I don't want to spoil the surprise. And they cause Southern morale to plunge. The Southerners previously had thought themselves on the verge of victory. They saw themselves as unbeatable, and now they realize we may be about to lose this thing, but they're obviously not going to give up yet.
Right, and we've really gotten into the weeds in this episode, but just to take a step back, consider where we were 2 episodes ago, where the Union was suffering defeat after humiliation, despite having overwhelming numbers and manpower, and the Confederacy really thinking themselves the spiritual heirs of the American Revolution, fighting the British with their gumption and plucky courage against a superior and better armed foe. who thought themselves invincible. But now the tides are turning. Now it seems like the right capable generals are in place. They're deploying tactics that actually work. They're taking action and moving faster than their opponent for once. So a shocking reversal of fortunes of the Confederacy, who thought themselves that they were on this noble mission. So there must be some doubt and soul searching that's taking place here. But we got to mention we cannot forget, we got to remind ourselves that all of these great things you mentioned, at least the ones we've talked about, they're happening in the West. We've got to see what can happen in the East. Can we have a victory, a real victory in the East? That's, everybody, and this drove Lincoln crazy, but a lot of the country, and especially people overseas, the British, the French, were completely fixated on the East. Lincoln would say, well, we've won all these victories in the West, and yet Britain and France and a lot of the Northern public, they just don't seem to care. They just want to, they're not happy until we get a victory in the East. So that's what we're looking for. And Lincoln, the statesman, but also the politician, knows that he needs a solid victory showing that the war is definitely coming to a close, or re-election might not be so easy.
Yeah.
And European powers who are sitting on the sidelines, they're not supporting the Confederacy, but the Union really wants to give them a sign not to throw their hat in or even think about it. So like you said, we need some closure happening out in the East. So as you alluded to, there are important things happening in the East at this exact same time. But we won't spoil that. So we'll show you what's happening out East in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles in the Civil War podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show in the podcast player of your choice and leave us a rating and a review. This helps us grow and reach new listeners. You can also find maps of the battle sites, show notes to each episode, and plenty of other history info by going to keybattlesinthecivilwar.com.